I think we're ready for takeoff. Good evening again, and welcome to the Morris J. Wass Center for Dialogue and to Simon Fraser University's growing downtown campus. My name is Andrew Petter. I'm the president of Simon Fraser University, and I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's lecture, Canadian Marine Biodiversity and the Consequences of Climate Change, Fisheries, and Aquaculture, the latest in the Canada Ocean Lecture Series. The lecture series was initiated in 2006 and is a joint initiative of the Center for Coastal Science and Management at SFU's Faculty of the Environment and the Newfoundland-based Shorefast Foundation and other partners. I would especially like to recognize Gordon Slade, who's with us this evening, I think seated over there. Gordon is a former Deputy Minister of Fisheries for the province of Newfoundland. He's also Vice President of the Atlantic Canada Opportunities Agency, former CEO of One Ocean, and Chair of the Shorefast Foundation. So thank you very much for joining us this evening. We also have a number of sponsors for this event, including the Royal Society of Canada, and we have with us Yolande Grise, the President of the Royal Society, just seated over there, and Jeff Flynn, who's Chair of the Expert Panel Committee. And again, thank you both for being here this evening, and thanks to other sponsors as well for your many contributions in making this evening possible. As an institution whose new strategic vision makes it a goal for SFU to be Canada's most community-engaged research university, it's fitting that we should partner with the Shorefast Foundation, whose own guiding principles are rooted in community values and, like ours, incorporate sustainability, discovery, and innovation. SFU's new vision commits us to maximizing our capacities to enhance the social, economic, environmental, and cultural well-being of communities both locally and globally, and through events like this to be BC's public square for enlightenment and dialogue on key public issues. The goal of the Canadian Ocean Lecture Series is to create awareness about Canada's vast marine environment and its importance to Canadians. Lectures to date have been held on the Atlantic and Pacific coasts, as well as in central Canada. Now, tonight's lecture follows on the release earlier today, which many of us heard of listening to the radio and the newscast throughout the day, the release today of the Royal Society of Canada's expert panel report, Sustaining Canada's Marine Biodiversity, Responding to the Challenges Posed by Climate Change, Fisheries, and Aquaculture. Following the lecture, there will be an opportunity for dialogue with Dr. Hutchings and two other members of the expert panel, Dr. Randall Peterson, professor in SFU's School of Resource and Environmental Management, and Dr. Brian Riddell, CEO of the Pacific Salmon Foundation. So store up your questions, take note of your concerns, and make sure that you have them at the ready for comments and questions following tonight's lecture. And with that, it is my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, the chair of the expert panel, Dr. Jeff Hutchings. Dr. Hutchings is Canada Research Chair in Marine Conservation and Biodiversity. He's a 2012 Killam Professor and Professor of Biology at Dalhousie University. Dr. Hutchings.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you all for coming out this evening. I want to acknowledge Simon Fraser University and Gordon Slade and the Royal Society of Canada for all of their efforts in bringing this particular lecture to bear this evening. As the President indicated of Simon Fraser University, this report was released today of the expert panel of the Royal Society of Canada, and I am chair, and I'm happy that Randall Peterman and Brian Riddell, two others of the 10-person expert panel, are here to answer questions this evening. So what I'd like to do this evening is provide you with an overview of what the report contains and give you a sense of what its purpose was, what we found, what we concluded, and ending with a series of recommendations that we provided. I also want to say, though, that the membership of the panel included people from Newfoundland and Labrador, Nova Scotia, British Columbia, Quebec, United States, and the United Kingdom, with expertise ranging from aquaculture and fisheries to marine biodiversity and genetics and ecology and evolution. And the members are indicated on the screen. So this provides you with a sense of the talk this evening and how it will be structured. And I'd like to begin by saying, why should we think about our oceans? Well, Canada's oceans constitute a vital biological and physical milieu that supports human health, societal well-being, and the creation of wealth. Canada has the benefit of and the responsibility for 3 marine coastlines that contribute to our society in numerous ways. For thousands of years, the oceans have provided habitat for species of traditional and cultural significance to Aboriginal people. Today, sustainably exploited fish populations and environmentally responsible aquaculture operations should provide secure local and national access to the protein and oils contained in seafood. Further, Canada's oceans provide space for numerous recreational and commercial activities. And on 3 sides of Canada, the physical integrity of natural coastlines reduces erosion and buffers the land from oceanic storms. Globally, marine life provides more than half the oxygen that humans breathe and serves as a potentially rich source for modern pharmaceuticals. That is, one of the reasons for wanting to sustain marine biodiversity is encompassed by the ecosystem services that the oceans provide. In particular, the so-called non-market ecological services. For example, although these have not been quantified from a dollar value for our oceans, they have for the boreal forests at approximately $700 million, which is more than 10 times the value of the commercial extraction taken from the boreal forests. About a week ago in Davos, Switzerland, it was estimated that the non-market ecological services provided by the oceans globally amounts to $38 trillion. And for some people, that's the sort of argument that one will have to make for members of parliament and others to perhaps realize that the oceans are worth paying attention to. So from a strictly financial perspective, the case for sustaining marine biodiversity and protecting marine ecosystems is based on the argument that the importance of species can be determined by their marketable value, things related to food and potential sources of medicine, recreational harvesting, and for their ability to provide non-market goods and services in the forms of things such as carbon sequestration and erosion control. But of course, many other sectors of society would also argue that there are other good reasons for conserving biodiversity, including the potential for species to provide new drugs, foods, or genes, the role of biodiversity in contributing to people's enjoyment of the oceans, including educational, recreational, and inspirational experiences, and that there are moral and ethical reasons for doing so. Although these benefits can be difficult to quantify, they do influence the ways in which society wishes to treat the marine environment. So from an overview perspective, what are the purposes of the report? Well, the purposes of this Royal Society report, I think, can be described as follows. And the first is to serve as an educational tool to increase awareness of Canada's oceans. Secondly, to describe trends in Canada's oceans and marine biodiversity. Thirdly, to evaluate past, present, and forecasted trends in 3 stressors that affect marine biodiversity: climate change, fisheries, and aquaculture. Fourthly, to describe and forecast how these 3 stressors have affected and are likely to affect marine biodiversity. Also, to determine whether Canada has fulfilled its commitments to sustain marine biodiversity. We have agreed to a variety of national and international commitments to sustain marine biodiversity in various ways. To what degree, to what extent have we fulfilled those commitments? And lastly, the last purpose of this report is to provide broad, strategically based recommendations to establish Canada as an international leader in ocean stewardship and marine conservation. But the report generally excludes mention of topics that fell outside of its mandate and its terms of reference. So although we focus on trends, past, present, and future, fishing, aquaculture, and climate change, we did not focus on other things that affect biodiversity, such as shipping, pollution, oil and gas exploration, invasive species, nor did we deal specifically with Canada's emissions targets or climate change policies, the various socio-economic costs and benefits of biodiversity. We've left that for others to address, and nor do we discuss things related to fisheries management. Having said that, invasive species does play a role in what we discussed, and Canada's emission targets are mentioned in the introduction. So why do the Royal Society view this to be a topic worth examination? It really comes down to a matter of geography. Canada is estimated to have the longest coastline in the world and one of the largest, if not the largest, territorial sea, estimated at just over 7 million square kilometers, which is about 70% of Canada's landmass, or twice the size of India, depending on how you want to view it. The seas, as I said, make up about 70% of the landmass. So Canada really, if one thinks about it carefully, is an ocean nation. We tend not to think of ourselves as such, but we are. Our motto, amare usque ad mare, from sea to sea, is sort of a simplistic way to recognize this, but we have arguably or possibly the world's largest ocean real estate, if you will, which gives us the geographical, if not moral, imperative to be a leader in the stewardship of our oceans, and nationally and internationally. 8 of 10 provinces and all 3 territories, comprising almost 90% of Canada's population, border on the salt water. What's in the oceans belongs to all of us, not industry, not to any particular individual, but to all Canadians. So we should share a stewardship responsibility to Canada and to the world. From a biodiversity perspective, there's various ways that you can quantify this. A more typical way, or the most typical, is to add up the number of species that there are. And in Canada, it's estimated that there are about 16,000 species, but it could be 2 or 3 times that value because there's still much to be learned and described. And you can see the numbers of species for various taxonomic groups on this slide compared to what is estimated globally. Now, what the panel focused on, though, is not trends in species abundance, but trends in population data, because that's something that we can quantify. There does tend to be trend data available for a number of different groups, and these patterns are described in the report from phytoplankton up to marine mammals. But I will say, though, that the fishes, not the sharks, skates, and rays, but everything else, tend to be the ones for which we have the most trend data, as you will see in coming slides. So let's start with the Arctic. When dealing with climate change and dealing with patterns, if one is interested in the oceans, one has to be de facto interested in the Arctic. The Arctic contains about 75% of Canada's coastline, so oceans issues are Arctic issues. And one of the trends that I'll draw your attention to at the base of the food chain is that of the increase in phytoplankton, the increase in primary production. Over roughly the last 10 years, that's an increase of about 43%. So there's more and more primary production being generated in the Arctic. And that's because there's less ice. Less ice, a greater amount of time of the year that the sun can penetrate the waters and generate photosynthesis. So that's one trend. Here's another trend. Many marine mammals are increasing in Canada following long and sustained periods of overexploitation. Examples on this coast include the Steller sea lion, the sea otter, which was actually extirpated from Canadian waters off BC in the last 2 centuries ago, I should say, but through a successful introduction program is doing quite well. The bullhead whale in the Arctic is increasing, and we are currently experiencing extraordinary increases in harp seal off the northeast coast of Newfoundland and gray seal in eastern Canada. But it's not true for all marine mammals, and one body that is charged with looking at trends in biodiversity is COSEWIC. COSEWIC, the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, is the independent science advisory body responsible for advising the Federal Minister of the Environment as to which species merit inclusion on the national legal list of species at risk in Canada. As of today, COSEWIC has assessed 640 species in Canada of being at risk, and of those 640, about 1 in 5 is a marine species. This is sort of a tally by taxonomic group of those marine species at risk as assessed by COSEWIC, and we'll begin with the mammals and just give you a couple of examples of marine mammals that are at risk. I showed you examples of those that appear to be doing quite well. The killer whale, the orca on this coast, has been recognized as 4 different wildlife species that have been variously assessed as threatened or endangered. primarily because of their low levels of abundance, and these are extremely well known and well studied whales on this coast. On the east coast, we have the northern right whale, which was reduced dramatically because of past overexploitation and is having difficulty recovering, primarily because of contacts with ships. Northern bottlenose whale is another endangered marine mammal on the east coast. For birds, there are 8 birds assessed as being at risk, 8 seabirds, and in terms of trends in biodiversity, there are some birds that are doing rather well, others that aren't doing so well. Here are 2 off this coast, Cassin's auklet and the tufted puffin, which have experienced 46 and 34% declines from 1984 to 2004. So here are 2 examples of species that have been in decline. In the Arctic, we have the ivory gull that's been assessed as endangered by Kosiwik. This is a species with a strong association with pack ice. When we've got reductions in the quantity and quality of ice, we reduce the quantity and quality of habitat for this particular bird. But if one looks at northern gannets, a common seabird on the east coast, everything is increasing. Available data at all of the colonies show general increases. So for seabirds, the trends are a mix, some good, some bad, some stable. But if one looks at the fishes, which comprise the largest group of marine species at risk assessed by Kosiwik, one sees a slightly different picture. Now, if you focus on this upper left panel, what you see is a combined multi-species or multi-population index. So this is essentially combining all of the population data for all available Canadian marine species from 1970 to present day. And the abundance metric is the current biomass relative to the biomass at which the maximum sustainable yield is estimated to be obtained. So you can think of that BMSY as a target. That's what you'd like to be above. So if you note the beginning of this trend, you see that in general we were above that line, that ratio of 1 to 1, but in the last couple of decades we've fallen below it. Overall, about a 55% decline if one collapses all of the species, the marine fishes together. If one looks at pelagic versus demersal, so the red shows the midwater species, the green, the bottom-dwelling species, basically they're in the same general area today, but there are very strong differences if we compare the Pacific to the Atlantic waters. In the Pacific, the bottom-dwelling species shown in green have been doing fairly well on average. They're on average above the target, above where we want them to be. That's not true for the pelagic species that tend to be declining regularly if one looks at a multi-species index. But in the Atlantic, since 1970, combining all of the data together, they have never been above this particular target level. Some examples of some rather dramatic declines. Canary rockfish on this coast, you can see the decline since 1980. The poor beagle, which is the only shark that is even today still harvested, a 90% decline since 1961. The American plaice is a flatfish, and it's experienced declines in excess of 90% over the last several decades. And the Acadian redfish, which is related to the rockfishes on this coast, you can see declines that are rather staggering since the late 1970s. And British Columbia's rockfishes, the coral reef analogs of the North Pacific, many of them have been assessed as by Kosiwik, and you can see some of their status assessments on the screen and some of their associated declines as well. But if one were to pick one marine fish that probably stands out on this coast, it would be the basking shark. This is Canada's largest fish. It's about 12 meters in length, and it was assessed as endangered by Kosiwik in 2007. Now, this is a species that was regularly seen off the west coast of Vancouver Island. There are very reliable reports of tens, occasionally hundreds of basking sharks seen in areas such as Barkley Sound. But in the 1940s, there was a fishery for this species, for its liver. And starting in 1954, there was a pest eradication program undertaken by the Federal Fisheries Department. The issue being that basking sharks, they feed near the surface, they open their mouths and just swim forward and extract invertebrates into their mouth and against their gills, but they also interact with salmon gill nets. So from 1954 to 1971, there was The Federal Fisheries Patrol boat, the Comox Post, had a blade fashioned to the bow, so when one saw a basking shark, the shark was hit with the blade, and the blade is apparently in a museum in Port Alberni. So that's one example of a fish that hasn't done so well on this coast. On the other coast, one can point to Atlantic cod, which really stands globally as the most overfished species, or as an example of what can happen when one seriously overfishes a particular species. From 1962 to present day, the loss of cod amounts to about a loss of 2 billion breeding individuals. Now that's a lot. It amounts to the largest numerical loss of a vertebrate in Canadian history. That's really the way to describe the loss of cod. It's about 2 billion tons, which is a rather 2 billion metric tons, which is a rather difficult, or 2 million metric tons, which is a rather difficult number to grasp. So one could take the total weight of cod and translate that into polar bears. Well, that would be about 6 million polar bears. That's sort of a slightly silly analogy because there's only 25,000 bears globally. But if we put it into humans, it's about the population size of this country. So that's a lot. That's a lot of weight. That's a lot of biomass. This is a fundamental component, predator, of an ecosystem that no longer plays its former roles. What about trends in some of these biodiversity stressors? Well, if we look at climate change, since 1960, the ocean's net heat uptake has been about 30 times that of the atmosphere. But we tend not to think about the oceans from a climate change perspective. We tend to talk about land, and that's fine, that's appropriate. But it's extraordinary how much carbon dioxide and how much heat the oceans are absorbing. Indeed, if one goes back to the early 1960s, 90% of the global heat uptake has been borne by the oceans, and up to half of the CO2 in the atmosphere is absorbed by the oceans. So the oceans play a pretty critical role. Now, one of the consequences of this heat absorption has been a heating of the oceans. And if we look on this coast, you can see basically warm temperatures are indicated by red in these panels, cold temperatures by blue, and in the last 2 or 3 decades, the water temperatures here have been getting warmer. They have also been getting fresher. This is a measure of salinity on this coast. Red indicates saltier than average, blue fresher than average. So this trend of warming of the oceans and a freshening of the oceans actually leads to something called an increased stratification of the oceans, an increased layering of the oceans. And when that happens, there's reduced transfer of nutrients from deep waters to surface waters. This warming trend that we see on the west coast is also evident on the east coast. Data from the southern Gulf of St. Lawrence, for example. One can take a variety of different sources of temperature and extend the time frame back to 1880 or slightly earlier. And what one can conclude from this particular exercise is that the sea surface temperature has increased by about 2 degrees Celsius from 1985 to 2008, but that 2 of the warmest years of the last century occurred in the last decade. And that trend of warming is also evident off Newfoundland. In fact, that rate of increase of warming, that rate of change in temperature is far greater than any rate on an annual basis than from what we have seen previously. So the temperatures are increasing in the oceans. The Gulf of St. Lawrence is one area where in the deeper waters there's less and less oxygen. So in the early 1960s, basically you're looking at the red data points. When you fall below that black line, you're into hypoxic regions, areas where there's not enough oxygen to sustain most biological life. Now, although it dipped down in the early 60s, since 1984, hypoxic conditions have existed at this depth of almost 300 meters. And the same type of thing is evident here. For all time series of at least 25 years in duration, they all show declining trends in oxygen at depths between 100 and 400 meters. So we're seeing less and less oxygen in deeper waters. What about sea ice? If we're talking about trends generated by climate change, one has to look at the Arctic, but one also has to look at the Atlantic. And we tend not to think about sea ice in the Atlantic. But here are some fairly well-known trends in sea ice extent. The blue is for March, which is when the ice is at its greatest extent in the Arctic. The red is for September, when the sea ice is at its minimum extent in the Arctic. And you can see that in March, there's been a decline of about 3% every decade since the late 1970s, but in September the decline has been about 12% per decade. And the same types of trends are evident along the east coast and northeast coast of Canada. The red shows you the 90 to 100% ice coverage. In other words, coastal Labrador, Newfoundland, the Gulf of St. Lawrence typically have pack ice at this time of year, which is a fundamentally important platform habitat for many marine mammals. But in 2010, for example, was the lowest sea ice on record. If you can make out a little bit of yellow and green, that shows you where the sea ice was in March of 2010, as opposed to what is typically seen in March in all other years. So there's been a decline in the quantity and quality of sea ice in eastern Canada as well. Another thing that's changed, another trend that one can look at, is increased acidity. So a reduction in pH is evident in our waters. This is evidence or some data from the lower St. Lawrence estuary showing from the 1930s to roughly present day. These changes in pH represent a 37% increase in acidity. Now, in terms of fisheries and aquaculture, here are some trends that that our panel compiled for the first time. The blue shows you the trends in fishing mortality in the Pacific and in the Atlantic, and then the Pacific and Atlantic separately. And again, these data are similar to the current biomass relative to this biomass at maximum sustainable yield that I mentioned earlier. What you see on this axis is fishing mortality relative to the fishing mortality at which the maximum sustainable yield could be obtained. Basically, if the fishing mortality is going above 1, if it's above this red line, that's bad. You are fishing above the target. You are overfishing. Now, if we look at the Pacific, we've actually very rarely, combining all species together, have we been overfishing. Now, we have on some particular species, but not in a multi-species context. In the Atlantic, it's been just the reverse. We have typically been severely overfishing our stocks, and it was only with the collapse of cod and flatfishes and other species in the early 1990s that fishing mortality was actually reduced. These are some data which simply show you some catch information. A couple of things to note. You can see that catches in the Atlantic are shown in each panel in dark. In the Pacific, in the open circles, you can see the catches in all fisheries declining, particularly in the early 1990s, mainly because of the loss of cod in eastern Canada. But you can also see, and that's shown there by the bottom-dwelling fishes, the demersal species, but you can see the salmon, the diadromous species on this coast, catches declining dramatically from the early 90s to very low levels today. And the invertebrate fisheries were steadily increasing, notably in Atlantic Canada, really not on this coast, because with the loss of cod, we saw an increase in the amount of lobster, shrimp, and crab. Now, from a value, the landed value of all catches in the most recent year for which there are data was actually the lowest since 1985. So this is one of the products of overexploitation, is that the amount of money one is able to extract from these harvests declines. From an aquaculture perspective, this shows you the trends from a nascent industry in the early 1980s for the total aquaculture production in Canada, separated by finfish and so-called shellfish, oysters, mussels, and the like. And here's the value of aquaculture in 2009, almost $1 billion for fish, and about 10% of that value for shellfish. And in terms of fish production alone, again, this shows you the trends for Canada in total. BC is here. BC is the 4th largest producer of Atlantic salmon globally, behind Norway, Chile, and the UK. And on the east coast, in fact, there's been steady declines in New Brunswick, primarily because of an outbreak of a virus, ISA, about a decade ago. So what are the effects of some of these stressors on biodiversity? These trends that I've talked about from a climate change perspective are projected to maintain their current trends. So this is acidification, basically. This shows you declines in something called aragonite, or think of it as declines in calcium carbonate. This is a substance that things such as mussels and lobster and oysters require in order to build their exoskeletons or their shells. And off this particular station, which is off this coast, Ocean Station Papa, aragonite is projected to decline over time, and the bumps that you see is the projected variability in the amount of calcium carbonate. And the important thing to note here, from a climate change perspective, things always go up and down. There's a certain amount of variability associated with anything. But the point of this figure is to see that the variability is actually exceeding these blue lines. The blue lines are what are basically the variability that we have seen lately. So not only are we seeing a steady decline in calcium carbonate, or projected to, off this coast, but the variability about that decline is projected to be outside of the variability that we're currently seeing. There are forecasted changes in global sea surface temperature. These are models from the University of Victoria, and 3 different scenarios that play into the IPCC's projections for global changes in sea temperature in the ocean. And it doesn't matter which projection you use, they're all projecting an increase in sea surface temperatures. So the trends that we're seeing in climate change are not going to go away. There's a certain inertia that will not be slowed readily. So then there's a variety of consequences to biodiversity generated by these climate change stressors. We can anticipate changes in productivity through space and time, a loss of habitat, polar bears in the Arctic being one good example, spatial shifts in species distributions, and structural changes in marine food webs. We can't predict precisely what forms these changes will take, but almost certainly these changes will occur. As I say, in the Arctic, changes in not just the amount of sea ice, but the quality of sea ice, the amount of sea ice that is more than 1 year of age, for example. This matters a lot to the ring seal, which is the primary source of food for polar bear. So changes in sea ice from a biodiversity perspective in the Arctic will definitely affect these 2 species. This is work by William Chung here at the University of British Columbia in a report published for Environment Canada last year. And suffice to say that the upper panel shows changes in sea surface temperature, and this is in our report. Projected changes in sea surface temperature in Canada on a local scale, which is interesting because most of these projections are done on a global scale. And basically, the redder the color, the warmer the projected change is. And this panel is meant to provide a prediction of the rate of species turnover. So give you a sense of the gain and loss of different species. And in essence, it's predicted that species will move further north. There'll probably be losses to fisheries as a result, at least in our waters. In the Arctic, things might improve from a fisheries perspective. But the important point here is that there will be some rate of species turnover, species change, which will be manifested by changes in marine food webs. Again, picking an example on this coast, increasingly over the last 10 years, we're seeing more and more of this species, the Humboldt squid, which was a rare visitor to these waters. It's typically found in the Southern California, California Current area, but is now increasingly found here. Another example of how food webs can change as a result, probably of climate change, are changes in the abundance of 2 keystone fishes. And this is based on diets from the thick-billed murre, the north end of Hudson Bay. Arctic cod, the key prey species in the Arctic, has been declining, at least in the stomachs of the murre, and that of capelin is going up. So one interpretation of these trends is that capelin might be replacing, or is certainly moving farther north into the area currently inhabited by Arctic cod. Now, this admittedly comes from seabird stomachs, but this kind of analysis is often a good proxy for real changes in the environment. And in the Arctic, we have very few means of monitoring changes in biodiversity. And in terms of changes, another way in which climate change can affect ocean marine biodiversity is in a way that you might not anticipate. When you change the temperature, you are changing metabolic processes, you are changing productivity. You're changing a variety of things, that are all dependent on temperature and energy acquisition and allocation. So for example, there's this particular species of zooplankton, Neocalanus plumcrus in the Strait of Georgia. This is the dominant species of zooplankton, a fundamentally important species for all sorts of things, and there has been a decline in the date, or an earlier and earlier date of peak abundance of this particular zooplankton, at least associated with the warming of the water temperatures. So it's possible that these changes in the blooming of zooplankton might be attributable to changes in water temperature, and that might be linked to some earlier hatch dates that we see for some seabirds. This is all correlational, it's not cause-effect, but that's basically what we're dealing with when trying to predict what will happen from a climate change perspective. Fishing directly impacts biodiversity primarily by reducing abundance. That's pretty clear, but it can also affect biodiversity by directly affecting the bottom, the quality of the habitat, and the organisms that live there, such as sponges and corals. And fisheries can have significant impacts on food webs. There's no question about that. You reduce the abundance of a particular predator and one species, you will change the way in which other species interact. In the Northwest Atlantic, a very good example, with declines in redfish, skate, and Atlantic cod, we see increases in shrimp and snow crab, things that cod formerly preyed upon. So you reduce the predator and the prey increase in abundance. In the Gulf of St. Lawrence, we have one of the most important and serious manifestations of a fisheries-induced alteration to a food web, and that is in the form of cod in this particular part of the world. In 1987, Southern Gulf cod was actually the largest cod stock in the world, but since then you can see the trends always have been in a declining fashion. Gray seals in this area have increased from roughly 10,000 to 440,000, at least that's for Atlantic Canada as a whole. And it's hypothesized that increased gray seal predation is responsible for increased natural mortality of cod and other species. In fact, cod are not able to sustain themselves at current levels of mortality. They're not able to replace themselves. They're dying at too high of a rate. The same is true for this species, the white hake, that we severely overfished in the 70s and 80s. But in the 70s and 80s, the chance of surviving from one year to the next was about 20%. Sorry, that's the mortality. Your chances of dying were about 18% every year. Now, if you're a white hake, your chances of dying are about 90% every year. So this is also true of some other species in the Southern Gulf. So a good example of how fishing can significantly affect food webs with some dire consequences. From an aquaculture perspective, this panel on the right shows you the location of aquaculture farms. About 95–96% of all aquaculture farms in eastern Canada are located in this area. This also happens to be the area of the most endangered populations of wild Atlantic salmon. And escapees from net pens interacting with wild salmon has been identified by COSEWIC as one of the threats to wild salmon in this area. On the left panel, you see the location of various shellfish tenures in southern British Columbia. And one of the issues for shellfish aquaculture is the large use of non-native species that are not native to British Columbian waters. And of course, there's a variety of other environmental and biodiversity impacts associated with open net pen aquaculture. Some of them are going to be very local in space, resulting from the release of fish waste and chemicals and so on in the water column. We've also got issues, though, of fish escaping from the net pens. On the east coast of Canada, this is particularly important because escaped fish can interbreed with wild members of the same species. But we also have issues associated with diseases and parasites, where there is a real potential for the exchange of pathogens from farm salmon to wild populations. So for aquaculture, for climate change, the impacts on biodiversity are broad, and they're not readily reversible. For fisheries, they're very extensive on the Atlantic coast and somewhat on this coast as well. For some cases, those changes are reversible, but clearly not in all cases. From an aquaculture perspective, there are some local impacts on biodiversity that are likely to be reversible on a small spatial scale, but there might well be broader impacts associated with pathogen transfer and interbreeding with farmed fish. So what are our biodiversity obligations? I'm not going to go through them, but I will point you to the panel. These are 4 pages from a table. There are 6 other pages like this that detail our national and international obligations to sustain marine biodiversity. And there are some examples that you can see in that table. So we have committed ourselves under a variety of different agreements, the UN Law of the Sea, the UN Fish Stocks Agreement, which is part of that, the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, to which we are a party extending back to 1992. Nationally, we have 3 key laws: the Fisheries Act, which dates from 1868, the Oceans Act from 1996, and the Species at Risk Act from 2002. So we've committed ourselves to doing a variety of different things. But when the panel asked or addressed the question, has Canada fulfilled its national and international obligations to sustain marine biodiversity, the panel felt that the evidence was mixed as to whether we had truly achieved a lot. There were some strengths. There are some strengths. There have been significant contributions that Canada has made to fisheries management reform in international waters. And NAFO, the Northwest Atlantic Fishery Organization, is one such example. The Oceans Act, when it was passed, was truly a landmark piece of legislation internationally from an ecosystem-based management perspective. And there is an excellence and a rigor and usually a transparency associated with the scientific advice to decision makers within the Department of Fisheries and Oceans that we should laud. And when I say usually, I'm referring to things such as scientific advice on species at risk. We are not party to, we as members of the public are not party to what that scientific advice is to the minister as to whether a species should be endangered or threatened. So, but notwithstanding some of these strengths, the panel concluded that most of Canada's national and international obligations remain unfulfilled. One of these deals with the implementation, the full implementation of the precautionary approach. The precautionary approach recognizes that the absence of full scientific certainty shall not be used as a reason for postponing decisions where there's a risk of serious or irreparable harm. Now, we agreed to implement the precautionary approach when we became party to the UN Fish Stocks Agreement. The UN Fish Stocks Agreement, almost 20 years ago, stipulated how signatories will apply the precautionary approach. And basically what it means for any fish stock that you're harvesting, in essence, you should have a target, something you want to achieve, you have a limit, something you want to avoid, and in between you have what are called harvest control rules. Some rule about how hard you're going to fish that stock depending on how close or how far it is away from your target. The issue is, though, from a Canadian perspective, is that we're not setting targets. We're not setting target or limit reference points or establishing harvest control rules for most of our fisheries. What you see on this panel here is the current biomass of fish stocks relative to the biomass at which maximum sustainable yield is predicted to be obtained. Again, any value above 1 is good news. Anything below 1 means that the biomass is below the target. And these flags show you roughly where different national or international jurisdictions lie within this particular state space. So Canada has not performed all that well relative to many other well-developed fishing nations from a fisheries management perspective. That's a precautionary approach. One other example I'll draw your attention to has to do with the establishment of marine protected areas. These two graphs show you trends in protected areas in Canada. Terrestrial is in green, aquatic is in blue. It's not really marine because the aquatic line includes freshwater marine protected areas in the Great Lakes. So such that the total percentage of Canada's ocean waters that are protected is probably about 0.5%. Terrestrially, it's about 10%. So as society, we need to ask ourselves if this level of protection is something that we're happy with. Does this reflect our values? Does this reflect, is it fine to have these differences between the terrestrial and marine realm? It matters from an obligation perspective because we've committed under several circumstances to establishing a network of marine protected areas in this country. The most recent thing that we've agreed to do is to under the Aichi or Aiki biodiversity target, or one of the biodiversity targets, is to conserve by 2020 at least 10% of coastal and marine areas through the establishment of well-connected systems of protected areas. The panel felt that in order for us to achieve that this is what we're going to have to do in the next 8 years, and the panel felt that this was unlikely to be achieved. So the concern is that sometimes we make commitments, we make obligations, but we're not meeting them. This shows you where all the protected areas are in Canada, and if you're having difficulty seeing green against blue, there's a reason for that, and that's because 0.5% of the ocean is protected. There are apparently 160 MPAs in BC, but work published 2 years ago indicates that fishing is permitted in 160 of those. Again, as a society, we need to ask ourselves if this is a good reflection of our values. So lastly, and I'm almost done, the panel came up with 7 overarching recommendations. In recognition of the fact that Canada has multiple international leadership and stewardship responsibilities generated by the geographical realities of the length of the coastline and length of its seas, the panel recommended that the Government of Canada identify international leadership in ocean stewardship and biodiversity conservation as a top government priority. And one of the messages that I'll mention now and I'll mention at the end is that this report, although it is being interpreted as castigating a particular government department or particular groups of individuals, it should not be viewed as such. Instead, it should be viewed as a vehicle for change. What government could not or would not take this on as a leadership aspiration? I can't imagine any political costs to trying to establish or make Canada an international leader in oceans stewardship. So this was the first overarching recommendation of the panel. The second overarching recommendation, this one and the next one, deals with this issue of what the panel perceived to be a slow pace of fulfilling our national and international objectives, and that there are 2 key things impeding this pace. And we can say that because we're able to look at what other countries have done. The United States, Norway, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, the EU are able to do things and have things in place that we said we would do, but we have not yet done. So it can be done. Why is it not happening in Canada? Well, perhaps there are 2 key reasons. And I will also say something told the panel that it must be something institutional. Because in the 20 years since the northern cod fishery collapsed, we've had 8 parliamentary sessions, 4 conservative, 4 liberal. So it's not a partisan political issue. We've had 12 fisheries ministers, 7 liberal, 5 Tory. So it's not a particular minister you can point to. It must be something institutional. One of those issues is that deals with the regulatory conflict that the panel perceived to exist within the department. On the one hand, it's there to promote the fishing industry and the aquaculture industry, and on the other hand, it's there to protect the marine environment. And the outcome of trying to deal with this dual regulatory conflict is not always a positive one from a biodiversity perspective. There's a second issue, and that deals with the extraordinary discretionary power enjoyed by the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans. The Fisheries Act dates from 1868, 1 year after Confederation, at a period of time when women could not vote, when Aboriginals could not vote, at a time when overfishing and conservation were simply not part of the general parlance of society, when ministers had czar-like powers to make decisions over a variety of different things that fell within their aegis. Perhaps the Fisheries Act is really not an appropriate piece of legislation as an overarching piece of legislation to guide our actions to sustain marine biodiversity. The Oceans Act is a very good act, but again, the statute has not been implemented at a pace that I think many people thought. The Species at Risk Act is another piece of legislation for which the discretion enjoyed by the minister has played out by not listing marine species. And not surprisingly, a fourth recommendation from the panel is that although Canada has some reasonable statutes, although we have identified places where new legislation is probably beneficial, or revisiting of legislation is probably beneficial. We do have some very good policy. The Sustainable Fisheries Framework within DFO is a very good piece of policy. It's not being implemented. So Canada needs to rapidly increase its rate of statutory and policy implementation. Recommendation 5 is that Canada implement statutory renewal in order to fulfill our commitments to sustain marine biodiversity. The United States has an act called the Magnuson-Stevens Act, Magnuson-Stevens Fishery and Conservation Act. That act defines overfishing. If the Secretary of Commerce, analogous to the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans, is notified that a stock is overfished, within 2 years the Secretary must come up with a recovery plan, a management plan, and it must identify how that stock will be rebuilt within a 10-year time frame, if at all possible. In other words, it's a prescriptive piece of legislation. It stipulates what the Secretary or Minister must do if a certain set of circumstances presents itself. Our legislation in this area, Species at Risk Act, well, not the Species at Risk Act, but the Oceans Act and the Fisheries Act are very much discretionary pieces of legislation. And it's probably to the advantage of the minister to have less discretion. It probably would allow a minister to take a longer term view than what some of the than some of the shorter term perspectives that have generally guided things on the ocean side. Recommendation 6, that the Government of Canada establish national operational objectives, indicators, and targets for marine biodiversity. This is something that would be extremely useful for us to do. Come up with indices of biodiversity, maybe one for each coast. Maybe they will vary from habitat to habitat, but it would allow for us to monitor our progress through time by coming up with a biodiversity index or indices that we would then look at and have as a way of judging how well our policies are playing themselves out. And lastly, when you put a group of scientists together, they will have a recommendation that calls for more scientific research, but I think it's valid in this case. We do know a lot, and I do want to emphasize the strength of scientific advice that we have is extremely good. We know a lot about the effects of climate change and fishing and aquaculture on biodiversity, but we don't have the capacity to predict and forecast reliably what's going to happen in the future, particularly from a climate change perspective. There's a need to take our models and focus them on a local, regional, Canadian scale. Most of them are global right now. That's a challenge. And lastly, we need to maintain and have and expand our monitoring programs. You can't keep track of what's happening in the ocean, either from a physical, geochemical, or biological means if you don't monitor. And that's a fundamentally important element. And lastly, to repeat what I said earlier, that the report should be viewed as an opportunity and a vehicle for change. That's really what it's presenting itself to be. And as I say, it's not a political issue, it's not a ministerial issue. There is an impediment to Canada's progress, and that's evident by the fact that other countries are doing better than we are. And with that, I'd like to acknowledge a variety of different people who have contributed either to the presentation here this evening, to the preparation of the report in a variety of different ways, or provided reviews of the report, and indeed those who responded to the panel's invitation to submit evidence to the panel, which we did about 2 years ago, and we're grateful to those who did provide us with their submissions. And with that, that ends the lecture, and I believe now we've got time for questions. So thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Hutchings, and there is now an opportunity for us to respond, and to lead us off, I'd like to introduce Dr. John Nightingale, who's President and CEO of the Vancouver Aquarium and Marine Science Center, which is a sponsor of tonight's event, and John is going to initiate the conversation we're now going to have with the panelists. John?
So that's a pretty amazing collection of information and analysis. I deliberately didn't use the word data. I'm sure there was a lot of data in there as well. So it seems to me, if I were to summarize, I'd say that up to approximately now, the reductions that we've seen have pretty much been at direct human hands, overexploitation, direct human action. Now what we're seeing is all the indirect stressors coming in on top of the cumulative impact of those direct human actions. Many of those stressors are human caused as well, likely, but they have an indirect mode of action as opposed to a direct mode of action. So the conclusion I took out is that we're likely to see increasing variability. That was one of the trends that showed up in a lot of the graphs. So I guess I'd ask the question, given that policy, some of the recommendations that policy is made principally by politicians, but politicians, one would like to hope, respond to public will and public understanding. Have we met the enemy, and the enemy is us, in the sense that our scientific community is often accused of not being the best communicators in the world, and the general public, we all have interests and desires, and that extends on the range from nothing in my backyard to wait a minute, that's mine, don't change anything that I've become accustomed to. So do we have an impossible divide here, or did the panel talk about a way to begin to bridge, and do the steps go from science and the information somehow through to the general public and through to the politicians, or the other way around?
I'll just remind people that I'll thank John for his pogo-like question, and remind people that we have 3 members of the panel with us to respond. In addition to Dr. Hutchings, we have Dr. Peterman and Dr. Riddle. So if any of the panel members would like to respond to the question and observation posed by John, now's the time to do so.
Okay, John, you asked a very large set of questions, actually, so I'll just address one of them near the end there, which was you're basically asking whether there was a responsibility of the politicians and the scientists for what's been happening and what might happen in the future. I just want to remind everyone that some decisions are actually made at the lower level than the minister. So we've got a very large cadre of civil servants who've been involved right up to the deputy minister level in choosing to implement or not implement the various policies and acts that we've had before us. And we had no information on where the buck stopped, so to speak. And I have a feeling, though, that it's maybe in the culture of the Department of Fisheries and Oceans over the decades to take things cautiously because of the bipolar objectives that the institution has that Jeff pointed out. The objectives of maintaining the status of the biological system as well as generating social and economic benefits from harvesting the species that are here. So I think let's not lose sight of this. We all, in forums like this, we often talk about politicians. And of course there's some top-down directive that the Minister of Fisheries gives to the department. I know that, and maybe Brian can speak to that better. But there's also a responsibility from the bottom up. So let's keep that in perspective.
Thank you, Randall. Any of the other panelists want to take a run at this?
I think this is a really key thing, and that is how does one generate sufficient interest and sufficient political capital to allow politicians to act in particular ways. And maybe this is one of those areas where, I mean, we increasingly talk about this, and not just in Canada, but other countries, about maybe a lack of leadership. And this is maybe an area where politicians do need to lead. Again, other countries, Australia has a wonderful Biodiversity and Conservation Act in 1999 that politicians came up with. New Zealand has a very good act. Norway, in the last 3 years, has put together 2 very strong pieces of legislation. One could argue that, well, perhaps they're a little more linked to the oceans than we are, but again, I think the argument can be made that Canada is an oceans nation. And if politicians wished to take the lead on this, I think that there would be political capital and political support, and hopefully this panel's report provides Canadians with a little more knowledge than they had previously, and a little more awareness that this is a piece of real estate that we have a responsibility to look after, and for all sorts of reasons that affect our human health as well as environmental health.
Right?
Well, I think Jeff describes the situation quite well when he says that we believe that there is an institutional issue here. I don't think that you can really look at any single politician. They are people that spend enormous amounts of time, but they're strongly supported by large bureaucracies. And we've been asked this question now several times, and the only thing that I would say in terms of what John has just asked about, I think there is a responsibility at the individual level to really become more engaged in this. A lot of what happens within a regulatory department is that people look at immediate costs and what the change is going to be and the impact on people. And of course, people affect politicians. So there is a real emphasis on short-term costs. Everybody looks at the immediate costs. But what we really have to start getting across to people is that there's enormous costs also in not doing things. And the cod is probably one of the greatest examples. I said this morning in the media interview that I bet nobody in 1995 expected cod to never recover. So we simply don't know as much as some people may think we do. There's huge risks when you overexploit a stock, and the environment is changing, so we don't even know as much as we think we do now. So we really have to be more cautious. We keep saying that. Jeff brought that out in the talk. But we really have to have a way of expressing that we want to be more accountable and we want to protect the oceans at a higher level of security.
Well, we've had the benefit of an amazing amount of insight and information, and we have an incredible panel here with information and resources. And we're told that the answer in part is having an engaged citizenry, and we have that as well. So it's over to you now for any comments or questions that you may have. John.
First of all, Dr. Hutchings, thank you very much for the presentation. I think it was absolutely first rate. I want to make a comment. When I was Fisheries Minister in 1984 and 85, I asked my department to come and explain to me why I was receiving information all up and down the East Coast, mostly from fishermen, fishers to use the biblical sense these days, that the size of the cod was going down. And I asked, what is the trouble? And they came back and they said, Minister, there's no problem because our overall catch every year is going up. Now, by 1992, we closed the cod fishery. Now, there's been some talk about institutional problems. Well, if ever I saw an institutional problem, it was right there. And what is so amazing after all these years is to remember that the people who came back and said everything's okay were also scientists. And you just can't walk away from this. I want to relate something else. A gentleman that we all know, but I won't use his name, several years ago was in Ottawa with then Minister Reagan. And the senior financial person in the government turned on him and said, why should we spend any money on salmon? The salmon industry is declining and there's no value in it. Now that was at the top of the department. I had an occasion a week ago to remind the new fisheries minister that that's exactly what was said then, and they ought to find out who said it and get rid of him. But these are institutional problems. Now, my question really is this, and it's not critical of anything you've done, but I think it's important. Has any attempt been made to take this presentation to each of the political parties in the House of Commons and to the Senate? Because I can tell you that, because I've got the brief in front of me, not the whole document, of course, which is very extensive. All the average member of Parliament is going to hear is tomorrow, if the media does pay any attention to what was said today, is that the government is being attacked, and the government will go into defense, and the opposition will be running around trying to figure out what kind of questions to ask, completely ignoring the fact that they've ignored most of what you've presented to us for many, many years, as well as everybody else. But unless we get this into the minds of the people we elect, the best people in the world in a department are not going to be able to make the significant changes that are needed. And I raise that because, you know, I've been there. And since I ceased to be Minister of Fisheries many years ago, but I've been involved in fisheries, as some of you know, ever since, and right up until very recently with the Pacific Salmon Forum dealing with aquaculture issues. But unless we educate the members of Parliament, unless they know what is being said, unless they can understand the reality of what is happening, we won't get the political action that's needed. I mean, right now, DFO is running around trying to figure out how to get rid of everybody who might give them some independent advice. Now, the last thing I better admit to you is I'm a Tory. I've been a Tory since I was 17. I'm a real Tory. I'm a real conservative. And I don't believe for 1 minute that anybody is a conservative who is not a conservationist. We've got a lot of people running around, both in the United States and this country, calling themselves conservatives. They're just a bunch of right-wing nitwits.
For the few of you who don't know, this is the Honourable John Fraser, who I think is best described as a green Tory with a tinge of red every now and then. But if and a tremendous fighter for the environment, I might add, in many capacities. I wonder if the panel has any responses or reflections on John's comment.
Sure. Well, thank you, John, for that feisty oratory, as usual. And I'd like to put the question to you, though. As I was saying a few minutes ago, it's not clear to us, having been on the panel looking at the various lacks of implementation of the policies that are very good and the acts that are very good. How much of that is actually driven by the minister as opposed to the top civil servants?
You ask a question, you get a question, John.
Well, fair enough, but I know that a lot of people want to ask questions, so I don't want to be too long. First of all, an awful lot depends on the minister. If the minister has got brains and knows anything about the department to which he or she has been delegated, a minister can do a great deal. And it also depends on the deputy minister. Now, the federal system started this relève thing many years ago. And they move public servants around from one department to another, and those that seem to have certain abilities get promoted. But what you find again and again is that these people who get to the high positions in a department know nothing about the substantive obligations and mandate of the department. And we have suffered in Department of Fisheries and Oceans from this. I'm not saying that they aren't conscientious or they aren't honest or anything else, but if a minister, especially a minister who doesn't know very much about the department, is suddenly the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans, and if he or she doesn't have a deputy minister who really does know what is going on, and assistant deputy ministers, then that deputy minister is I don't want to say at sea because I don't want to be, you think I'm trying to be funny, but they're in real difficulty. That is why, a few minutes ago, I said, how do we get this presentation in front of every member of Parliament? There are ways to do it. You can go to the Speaker, you can go to the individual parties, it can be arranged. But this is a very important meeting here, and all the work that all of you have done is incredibly important. But we have to get it to the politicians. And ultimately, unless the minister knows the subject matter and has got the guts to act on it, and that's an important thing because they don't all have, then we aren't going to go anywhere. And the other thing is that the minister has got to be able to go to the deputy minister and say, listen, George, or Madeline, or whoever it is, what in hell is going on? I want to know. And if the minister doesn't do that, and if then the minister, the deputy minister can't really explain it, then you've got a real problem. And there's one last point I want to make. Department of Fisheries and Oceans is a huge department. I have always defended it. I've never agreed with people in BC who want to take all the powers of the DFO and turn them over to the tender mercies of, as Rafe Bear once said, the provincial government. But I can tell you this, if what happens out here doesn't get to the minister, then all the work we do is going nowhere. And I'll just give you an example. On December 6th, I wrote to the present Minister of Fisheries, Ashfield, and it was about a column written by a lady who's a scientist about what's going on with this incredible increase of harvest of herring from 235 tons or something to 6,000 tons. I have never had a reply from the minister's office, not even an acknowledgement. When he was here, because John Weston, who is a very active and hard-working MP, held a meeting in Squamish, I went up to the minister and I said, here's a letter I sent you. I haven't had a reply. And the minister looked at me, and I think he was telling me the truth. He said, I've never seen it. And I said, well, if I was the minister, I'd fire somebody.
So let me just recast the concern of the question here that John's posing, and that is has there been any thought or plan given by the Royal Society or by the expert panel to try to engage with government beyond the sharing of this information today, publicly, and through this lecture?
Well, I can say, first of all, I very much agree with you, John. You're exactly right. That's a key audience for the results of this report. I can tell you that 2 MPs contacted me today, and both of whom want to read the report. And I think that I've certainly personally given some consideration to appearing before the House of Commons and Senate standing committees on fisheries and oceans, because I think that's what one has to do. You have to talk directly to MPs. If there are other particular vehicles for communicating the results of this type of work, I think the Royal Society of Canada would be very open and interested in doing that, and I think the panel would as well. But your point is extremely well taken, and I can tell you this was a lot of work that we put into this, and it would be very nice. But it's not just what we put into it, because it actually it really reflects what a lot of people who have thought about these issues. I mean, some of what we came up with is not particularly new or novel, but it's an attempt to collate and provide recommendations. So it represents not just the work of the panel, but the work of many, many people.
Okay, thank you. Are there other comments or questions? I think there's one here. You have to get your microphone turned. There we go.
Yeah, it's Brenda Gertner, and I've been observing and working with governments and fisheries management in BC. And I just want to pick up on the first question and where we're going with that, because it seems to me modern governments typically have the challenge of how to balance, especially if those modern governments and their economies depend on resource extraction, how to balance resource extraction with biodiversity. And one of the things I was very interested in this report, and I've just been able to read the executive summary so far, is the comparison that you've done with other modern governments who have had the tendency of resource extraction for their economies, such as the US and Australia and other places like that. And so I'm curious, given the institutional concerns you have, what is it about their institutions that have allowed them to make some braver steps and that our institutions are not yet willing to take? Were you able to assess any of that?
Thank you. Go ahead.
Well, I can speak to the Australian case, and the act that Jeff mentioned, 1999 Australian, I can't remember the exact title, Environmental Protection Act, was actually passed well before the scientists had the ability to provide the scientific advice to manage on an ecosystem-based level. And yet, what was written into the act was an accountability system so that the government would follow through with that. And the science of marine systems is well advanced in Australia to many other countries because of that push from the legislation. And then, as Jeff mentioned, in the U.S., the Magnuson-Stevens Act has also very explicit requirements that if certain conditions are met, say a species is listed, automatically there's a process set in place where a recovery plan has to be enacted, or developed, and then it needs to be enacted. We don't have that legislative mandate here. There are policies that say we should do that, and the policies sound the same in words as those acts, except for the accountability measure.
So taking one step back from that question and your answer, the question then is what is it about our institutional structures that produces legislation that does not have those features? Were you able to go that additional step? Jeff?
Well, I think one sort of conclusion that one comes to when thinking about a lot of these things is that there are few or no political costs to making bad oceans management decisions in this country. And as long as the political costs of making ill-informed decisions are few, then they will continue to be made. And I think that speaks to a lack of engagement on the part of the Canadian population, that it's really only a small group of people in the lower mainland of BC and in coastal Newfoundland and Labrador and the Maritimes and parts of Quebec, but that it's not a huge amount of people from a voting percentage perspective. Most of the country lacks experience from the oceans, but on the other hand, that shouldn't necessarily matter. Most people have no experience with the Arctic, but that is something with some panache from a political perspective. So why have we not done what Norway and Australia and others do? For whatever reason, we as a country, as citizenry, have not valued what's in the oceans, arguably, to the extent that they have. And that's partly, could be because the oceans are more experiential for them, or more important to their economies. But the fisheries was once extremely important and could be once again. This is one of the sort of key overarching conclusions, I suppose you could say, that we came up with, is that, and again, this is not particularly novel, but the simple message would be to restore depleted species and populations to levels at which to basically restore the natural resilience of marine ecosystems, because that's what we're going to need to deal with climate change, is we need to rebuild the ecosystems so that they can deal with adversity, because it will be environmental adversity that will be at play. But why we don't do these things, I think it must ultimately speak to who we are and what our priorities are as a citizenry.
Others? Yeah, over here, and if you can identify yourself as the last speaker so graciously did, that'll be wonderful.
Yeah, my name is Alejandro Fried, and as someone who works in ecology, I'm quite concerned about the public perception of scientific uncertainty. Uncertainty is inherent to any scientific endeavor, but it often gets co-opted and misconstrued in a way as to give a public perception that we just don't know enough, so we might as well keep going with business as usual. So it seems to me that one of the important steps from the panel is to reclaim scientific uncertainty for what it really is, which is just a normal part of the discipline, and emphasize the certainties that we can be sure of, and get that across to the public. In dealing with aquaculture issues in BC, I feel a lot of the progress has been stalled by this misrepresentation of uncertainty. So in a way, it could almost be one of the panel's recommendations, maybe an informal one, to educate the media and the public about this.
Any of the panelists wish to respond? Randall?
Yes, well, this happens to be one of my hobby horses, so I completely agree with you that this is what we need to do. And we do mention in the report some of that, but not very much. We were mainly talking around the precautionary approach and how it should be implemented. The precautionary approach recognizes that there are uncertainties and risks associated with whatever actions we take. And I guess one important point that would be useful to pass on to this public audience is the comparative approach. That is, you're right, as an ecologist, we're often driven to make sure we fully explore and quantify the uncertainties in our knowledge. And we make our scientific advice, or we give our scientific advice to decision makers, documenting that uncertainty. When's the last time you heard an economist state uncertainty in the recommendations about how many jobs are going to be lost if this action is taken, or other non-quantitative measures? I'm afraid we have to not have a double standard here And essentially that's what you're saying. People are criticizing us as scientists, admitting the uncertainties when you know there's lots of uncertainties in all the other advice that the ministers receive.
Other questions or comments from any part of the room? Don't be shy. Yes, back over there. If you could identify yourself, please.
Devin Page. I work with Eco-Justice Canada. We pride ourselves on holding government accountable, but that's difficult given the discretion that the law affords ministers. But I think the thing that I'm struck about is you're a panel of scientists and you're actually talking about policy. And I find it really refreshing that people to whom we attribute expertise are talking about how we could potentially change society. And I'm curious, how did it happen that a bunch of experts got together and scoped the mandate to enable you to make those kind of comments?
I think we'll hear how the Royal Society is stepping up in new ways, but...
Well, I will say one person who's not here, who was very instrumental in this regard, is David van der Zweg, who's in the Faculty of Law at Dalhousie University. And he was very instrumental in collating all of the biodiversity obligations that Canada has from a national and international perspective. It's an area that he's worked on for quite some time. But I think it's also one of those things that, I mean, why is it that a group of scientists would end up focusing on these types of things? I mean, for those who work in fisheries, policy is not that far away, of course, from what scientists involved in fisheries or fisheries-related things do, because of course policy is one means of implementing or of effecting intentions from a precautionary approach perspective, sustainable harvesting, basically saying here's the policy, here's what we want to do, and it's science that needs to provide some of that advice. So as scientists who were involved either in a species at risk element, as I have been, or we have, Brian's worked for Fisheries and Oceans, Randall has lots of experience as well. I think that policy is not as far away as one might think initially, at least for those working on some of these types of issues. That's the best.
I wonder if Yolanda or
But
Jeff,
Brian might be able to say.
Go ahead, Brian. And then I was going to ask our Royal Society friends to talk a little bit about this initiative, because the Royal Society is a body that has traditionally celebrated academic excellence and research excellence, but has taken this additional step of creating these expert panels. So maybe after Brian, we could just hear a word about that initiative, which I think is what's brought this panel together. Brian.
Well, I think that's an insightful question, and probably each of these panels go in different directions. But if you look at the composition of this panel, I would have to support what Jeff has said. I mean, Jeff has been involved with this type of activity for a long time. Randall, as an example, as a chair in risk assessment for Canada for a number of years, very well known in that. My experience in applied management of science with fisheries for 30 years, I would have to admit one of the reasons I eventually left was the frustration in not achieving the end goal, things like the wild salmon policy. Over a decade of working on that and not seeing it go to full fruition. And that we have very good policies. It's not like we're isolated from the world. We know what's going on. We have excellent people to draw on. But there is this, when you sit down as a group and start looking across the board, why would a country as advanced as Canada be performing below what they say they're doing? And that it's a personal concern of mine. I don't think we should be there. But there clearly, as Jeff has said, it must be something institutional. And we can take Brenda's advice and look at the other countries and say, what is it about their processes that would make them perform any better? Is it really simply public commitment? I have a hard time believing that. There must be something in process, and as an example, I'd go back to the U.S. Magnuson Act. They have very powerful regional councils that are very in touch with the environment and with the communities and with the resources. And they're the ones that make recommendations to government for action. And so do we need to look at that? The Department of Fisheries and Oceans has more consultation processes than you'd care to know about. And but there is a breakdown someplace that we need to take very seriously and look at what are we missing here? Why are we not actually achieving goals that we know we have to achieve?
Jeff, do you want to just sort of talk a little bit about what the Royal Society is doing and this kind of initiative, which is really a new direction for the Royal Society?
Well, the Royal Society chooses topics for expert panels by surveying the membership of the Royal Society and asking for topics that are in the public interest. That is the mandate of the Royal Society, is to do something that is of service to Canadians. And so the expert panels that we've run this year so far, for example, the oil sands was one of them, end-of-life decision-making, marine biodiversity, and there's one coming up in the summer on early childhood development. All were chosen from a large variety of topics that came into the society, and it's the job of my panel to sift through these ideas and choose something that they think will be of some interest and perhaps even engender discussion right across the country. Now, having said that, I'd just like to respond to what Mr. Fraser was saying previously about how you get to government. Now, Jeff Hutchings was a member of a panel back in the 90s on genetic diversity of foods, biotechnology, and he addressed the issue of aquaculture in that. That was a government-sponsored expert panel, sponsored by Health Canada, to whom we reported. I don't think they acted on a single thing in that, especially as regarding aquaculture. And so in taking it to government, even when they sponsor it themselves, they don't always pay any attention, especially if it doesn't fall in with their political mandate of the time. So all the Royal Society tries to do is take topics, get a panel of really excellent people. They're not all fellows, they're chosen from all over the country and the world to give the best possible information to Canadians. And we hope that the politicians will pay regard to that. That's the objective.
Okay, and an incredible resource to us as Canadians and as citizens as we move forward. Other questions or comments of the panel? Over here, yes.
My name is Gordon Slade from Newfoundland, and you know, we rarely hear the term oceans mentioned. You know, it's fisheries issues that we hear about. So the citizens, the general public, doesn't know enough about the issues that are out there about the ocean, the health of the ocean, and so on. The question I have is, how do we get the public to better understand these issues that, of course, go way beyond fisheries issues, and they're important to all Canadians. They're important to everyone on this earth. So whose responsibility is it to Royal Society to get this message out to the general public? I would suggest that provincial governments, even though they don't have the jurisdiction for the oceans and for things in the ocean, should know about this. This is important. And I would like to see myself that an effort be made to communicate the results of this panel to a very broad audience of Canadians.
Thank you. Any of the panelists wish to respond? Jeff?
Yes, Gordon, thanks very much. I think this is one of those things that I think the panel struggled with. I think many of us struggle with these things. John introduced it to us this evening. How does one communicate these things appropriately and to whom? I think the more I'm listening to what people are saying this evening, communicating with MPs is vitally important, but I think it needs to be done under the auspices of one of the things that I think the panel was trying to achieve, is that this is a vehicle for change. And you can do good political things. I mean, the first recommendation of the panel is that ocean leadership, international leadership in ocean stewardship be a top government priority. I can't see a political cost associated with that. I can see lots of political gain. And I think that there are a number of things. If a politician or a party was seen to be the driver of change, the driver of improving what we currently have in this country, a drive to be an international leader, to say, you know, to the rest of the world, we have all this ocean real estate and we're going to do something about it and we're going to mean it. I mean, these are the types of things that politicians like to do good. And I think that would be the way that I would communicate this, is not as a document of criticism and saying what's bad and so on, but as a vehicle for change. And that's the message that I would communicate to MPs.
Others? Over here, yeah, please identify yourself.
Yeah, I'm Rick Routledge from Simon Fraser. I'd like to ask a question about communicating through the media as well as directly to politicians. I've had a lot of difficulty over many years getting the media to be interested in some of these issues and to cover them. It takes something pretty provocative to get their attention. I've noticed, especially in Canada, the United States media seem to be much better at this. We need to do something to communicate these important scientific and conservation issues to the general public. And that seems to me it has to be through the media somehow. I wonder if any of you have any comments on how we might do that better.
Any of the panelists? Brian? Brian?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's tough to really get a media group interested in it. I think maybe the panel, for example, you could submit editorials or submit something that has a layout that you could really get your message across, and then other groups would pick it up. But I mean, I really do wonder if media is the way you really want to get this main message out. I was thinking as Jeff was talking that the political side is one of the really important ones, but that's only half the coin, in my opinion. The other one is to do things like John Nightingale, especially at the aquarium. You got to get publicized. You got to communicate with the public and with children coming up. I mean, we're not going to resolve this immediately, and that, but we can go to experts. And I mean, obviously, you got to use social media now if you really want to get the widest distribution of the message. But you got to bring it down to a level that people understand and they appreciate the seriousness of the risk of not doing something. It's not an easy sell, and that, but I think that it's an important point. I wouldn't bank on the media. I've had extremely good experience, and I've had extremely bad experiences. And you know, something as important as this, I think you've really got to control the message and keep putting it out there.
Others? Yeah, I'll go to people who haven't spoken yet. Over here, yeah.
Thanks, Phil Malloy, UBC. On that note, you know, come to talks like this, and generally I feel like most of the people in this room probably are already on board with the general message of we need to be doing things differently, we need to be doing things better. So, you know, often when this question comes up of how is it that we communicate better to the public, and I feel like that's a question that most people who tackle these issues aren't trained to answer. We're not communication specialists. We're not, you know, you look at the things that the public is interested in, and usually it's being marketed in a way by people who've spent their lives training to be very good at marketing and very good at communication. So really the point is, perhaps we should be looking at engaging a broader group of people in our general effort to try and do a better job of communicating the issues that we want to communicate, which involves, you know, getting communication specialists, marketing specialists, advertising specialists on board to help us get the message out. Maybe we need to think a bit more broadly about who we work with.
That was a comment, but I don't know if there's any response. Yes, Randall.
Yes, I do have a comment, and it's very simple. I would think that it's the public that should put the pressure on the media to have them report what it is you want to know about the oceans in this case, rather than getting, as we get on the CBC News tonight, a 1 minute or less clip of a few of the recommendations that were the most critical of the government. Presumably, we want to get the message out that, hey, there's some cost, as Brian said, to not doing something. There's a tremendous amount of benefit to what oceans produce for us, socially and economically. And that's the sort of message that I think we need to push the media. I mean, how many minutes per day are spent on sports broadcasts versus science broadcasts? Guess who drives that? It's the consuming public. So give them some feedback.
I guess I just observed from personal experience, and I'm maybe picking up on some of Brian's misgivings about the media, is that there is an inherent bias in the media in favor of conflict and in favor of equivalence. We've seen that on climate change, you know, to create the sense that there's an equivalent argument on the other side, even though there may not be, and to promote conflict as the easy story to tell. So whether the media is the best filter for carrying a complex and important message is, I think, an interesting question that has sort of been posed and answered somewhat differently by two of the panelists. Over here, yes.
Good evening, I'm Emily Chiscato. I'm a student at UBC, and I just wanted to make a comment about communicating what we've been talking about tonight to the public. I feel like I am actually part of the public. I think everyone in this room has really different backgrounds and levels of knowledge regarding these matters, but if every single person in this room tonight went back home and wrote down and expressed the feelings and the thoughts that they perceived during this meeting and put that down in writing and tried to get it out there to someone, I don't know, maybe the politicians we're talking about or the media, instead of having them depending on what the media wants to let the public know. If everyone in here would try to make a step and contribute to the news getting out there, I don't know if it's just a utopic view, or I don't know, do you think that if every single person in here promised to themselves and to everyone else that they would go home and do that, would that make any difference, and would it count?
Any of the panelists? We have seen the solution, and it is us.
I think at its core, that's where it has to start. And I think that's you make a very good point. And it's people only become engaged when people interact with one another on a particular topic and communicate and talk about things. And I would say I see nothing with what you're saying to disagree with.
Yeah, over here.
I'm Cam Young, and I'm a student at SFU as well. And this is kind of in the same vein as previous questions in terms of bringing information from the researchers to the public. And it kind of involves, instead of just bringing this raw information to the public, and I mean, it's all great information, but just taking that one step further and kind of coming up with direct actions that individuals can do, kind of in terms of really simple things that they can do in their day-to-day lives, like what food they put on their table, and other kind of consumer choices, and even kind of your 7 overarching conclusions on make it, instead of for policymakers, for individuals, like don't buy certain products or things of this nature. I'm just wondering if that can be done, if instead of just information, it can be actions that we can bring to the public.
Okay, great question. Are there certain actions that can be taken in respect of food products or other strategies that could be pursued to support some of the policy changes needed? Brian?
Well, I think there are, but I think that it's probably not the role of the society in this panel to do it, because we would be then, pushing our same point again, but we're a small group. You've got to get it distributed. And that, I think, is one of the great roles that the local non-government organizations can do. David Suzuki Foundation, World Wildlife Fund, the Salmon Foundation. We can get this information out, and that working with groups like the Aquarium, when I see Craig here with Watershed Watch, there's an ability for other groups to really support this report and to get those sort of messages out there about what people can do, and then it's not just the same little core group. And that I don't think there's any question that the comment earlier about using other communication experts is highly valued. And it's very true. But I don't think it's true that we don't have good communicators in Canada. I've heard Jeff now give this 3 times. It's not a simple thing to present, and he does it extremely well. And then you have a gentleman like David Suzuki, who's probably has one of the longest running television shows in the world now, right? All about nature. I think it was 1971 it started. So, I mean, we have excellent communicators, but we think we really need to take a sort of broader look at how we get that message out, like the young lady said. Get it out as many people as you possibly can.
So I'm mindful of the time. I think perhaps three or four at most more interventions, and I'll go over here.
Good evening. My name is Sabina Jessen. I work with the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society. Have been working on ocean conservation issues for over 20 years in BC and nationally. And I'm actually currently working on my PhD at Simon Fraser University, and one of the issues I'm looking at is how do you explain the differences between Canada and other countries on the political side of making decisions around marine conservation? I'm going to have the opportunity to look more closely at Australia this year through a fellowship and research there. But I actually want to pick up on a couple points that Gordon Slade and Emily made about how do we as individuals influence that process. And maybe I'd like to put a question to the audience here. Before I do, I just want to relate a story that will pick up on this. I met once with a former MP and was trying to engage him in ocean issues and trying to get an understanding of what did he know, and so that I could figure out what I needed to, how I needed to best approach him. And his first reply to me was, I never had a constituent come and speak to me about ocean issues. So my question to all of you is, how many of you have gone to see your member of parliament? Do you know who your member of parliament is? And have you discussed your concerns about what is happening to the ocean and asked him or her to do something about it?
I think that's a question. We have one enthusiastic supporter of the question. And I take it was not a rhetorical question, but it was a question for us to think about and take away rather than answer verbally and answer in our own heads. So thank you for that. Anyone else want to? Yeah, over here.
Yeah, Bill Wareham with the David Suzuki Foundation. My question is about the communications and in these projects that come up with the Royal Society, and we've seen them before. I guess when I first read this and saw this, I thought, well, we're ringing the bell again. We ring it every couple of years. I agree with what someone said. Most of the people in this room know a lot of this and live and work and engage trying to deal with these issues. And I see out there a lot of money going to a lot of things, including research initiatives that replay the story. And what's missing to a large degree, I would say, in something like this is there an opportunity for the Royal Society to say, if this cost whatever, $500,000, can you throw $500,000 of parallel outreach money? And it doesn't just have to go to communications around media. It has to go to concerted strategies with civil society organizations, some of them environmental, but that's not always the best frame. I think we need a lot of different spokespeople on this. It's not just the scientists, it's not NGOs. It needs to be people who are valued and respected in our current society and politics to speak out on these issues. And outreach strategies that really get strategic around engaging the right people, doing presentations, whether it's to MPs, to business groups, and the like, I think is 90% of the work on this stuff. So as one of our old colleagues who I miss dearly, Jim Fulton, used to say, we don't need another stillborn report, right? We need to find ways to get the message out. So I would encourage the Royal Society, and I don't know if it's an option, but to throw strategic outreach money at these things.
I think I'll say in defense of the Royal Society, the Royal Society is not a funding agency and is trying to scrape together the few funds it has. But there are funding agencies, obviously. There are granting councils and others. And they do have within their program envelopes grants that speak to knowledge mobilization. I don't think they go so far to speak to advocacy. But I just don't think we should put it on the back of the Royal Society unless Jeff wants to tell us he's got some deep pockets there I don't know about.
I think people would be absolutely surprised at how little this costs, because it's all voluntary labor, and the actual prosecution of the whole process was much less than $500,000 and much less than $50,000 in fact.
Yeah, because I just want to add to that. I think a lot of people look at the environmental organization and say, well, you guys run with it. And we're trying desperately, and we're having a challenging time raising the money to do the work that we know we need to do to get communications ramped up. So I would just suggest that collectively we have to find the ways to use our community in a way that pulls money into doing outreach at that strategic level.
And one thing I would add is I think universities can do more, not so much in advocacy as institutions, but in knowledge mobilization and in fostering dialogues like this. And to engage more with the community and mobilize the knowledge they have to empower people in the community and organizations like yours to be able to carry that message more effectively than universities traditionally do. Yeah, here. Go right ahead.
Thank you. Morgan Reed. I'm the Education and Outreach Program Manager of a small but old organization here, the Marine Life Sanctuary Society of BC. Was the group that managed to put together a marine protected area at Whitecliff Park with a lot of collaboration. So looking toward the future in education and outreach programs, we're thinking about what do we do with education programs for the 21st century. And these need to be more than providing students or teachers or citizens with opportunities to learn about the facts and data, but actually investment and the capabilities to be citizens who make informed decisions and take strategic and tactical action for values that they're committed to. And so my question for the panel, to help with our early process in the education strategy, is what does it mean to be a citizen of an ocean nation?
Okay, who in the panel wants to grapple with that question? Tough question. Randall.
Well, I think we've heard some examples already here of how to do that, and that is everybody should be engaged with people that they think are going to help change the state of the system, the institutional system, the biological system, the physical system. And by that I mean just making sure you communicate what you know about these concerns that are well known among people in this room, and also hold the people that you talk to accountable. It's the lack of accountability in implementing these policies and the acts that I think really struck home to us partway through our panel process. That is the big gap. There are great scientists in Canada. They're producing great information. We've got excellent policies in words, but they just aren't being implemented.
So I'll go to two final people for who haven't spoken yet. Over here. Yeah. And then over here.
Yeah, thank you. Craig Orr, Watershed Watch. I'm hearing a lot about communications, and I'm a big fan of it, but I'm also wondering if we're being strategic enough, and maybe the panel can provide some advice. What do you do with people who don't want to hear your messages? They've got their minds made up. For instance, they tend to be a little dictatorial, and they think that jet fighters and prisons may be more important than maintaining biodiversity in oceans. In fact, they direct budget cuts in their departments, and you know, just last Friday we had a deputy minister and a minister, you know, just up at the Four Seasons Hotel tell a whole bunch of people that they're changing the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, and they use words like modernization and efficiencies and streamlining and cutting red tape and increasing certainty in the harvesting sector. You know, and this is while we're still waiting for the results from the Cohen inquiry on sockeye as well, which is, you know, I think it's a bit disrespectful to say the least. But you know, how do we break through to those kind of people? And you know, John talks about making sure you have a good deputy minister, but if they're following marching orders about departmental budgets, you know, what's our hope of you know, making substantial changes when we're up against that?
I think at the end of the day, I mean, this is great that everyone's concerned about communication, but it all comes down to basic human values. And talking to MPs, absolutely. But there are some fairly simple, straightforward things. One good example to my mind is that it's been 20 years since the greatest numerical loss of a vertebrate in Canadian history, and we still don't have a target for recovery for northern cod that put 40,000 people out of work, cost $3 billion for social assistance on the part of the federal government. What more does one need? What more of a reason does an individual in this country need to communicate with decision makers? I find it's important that we talk about how to communicate, but just do it.
Over here.
My name is Kim Wright. I work with the Living Ocean Society. Earlier on in the talk, you were talking about ecosystem services, and made a comparison to a dollar value that was attributed to the boreal forest. And I think that's maybe one of the big gaps. You talk also in your answering to the last question, you talk about values. Like you have to, you know, to hit it home, you have to strike people where their values are. And it's an unfortunate circumstance of our days and our government and our society right now. But if you can attach a dollar value through ecosystem services, and maybe this is more a question, you know, to the scientists, it's the degree to which the messages that go forward, whether it's to the public or to the government, wherever a dollar value can be attached in terms of what does this biodiversity loss mean, then people can grasp that, especially, you know, if you're trying to communicate with politicians, and if you can put it into numerical terms, it might make a difference. And I don't know whether that is something that can be done as a step between, you know, talking about we need policy change or we need biodiversity. Like, how can that be done?
I think that would be a wonderful topic for another Royal Society expert panel. But I do want to say that I agree with you entirely that at one level, many people feel uncomfortable in putting dollar values on these things. On the other hand, that's what a lot of people respond to. They don't respond to value systems and the like. There has to be a dollar value put on it. And perhaps within the next 10 years, and I know there's people in this room who are working on things such as environmental accounting and having goods and services truly reflect their environmental costs. And in terms of jobs, in terms of lost opportunities, monetary opportunities, that I think is coming at some point. But I agree with you that that's the type of thing that has not yet been done for our oceans and probably needs to be done.
Well, I'm, as I say, mindful of the time, and I did commit that we would bring the formal session at least to a conclusion around 8:30. But our co-host, the Shorefast Foundation's representative, Gordon Slade, I know wanted to make a final comment, and I'll do him that courtesy as co-host. Gordon.
Thank you. I think one very practical thing that Simon Fraser and Shorefast Foundation can do in communicating the message is to have Dr. Hutchings give this lecture across the country as part of the Canada Ocean Lecture Series, as other lecturers have done in the past, and I'll certainly do whatever I can on the east coast of Canada to help facilitate that. And I think giving this lecture in various cities will be one measure we can take to get the message out there.
Well, thank you very much for that. And I want to thank our sponsors. I want to thank the Shorefast Foundation. I want to thank the Center for Coastal Studies and Management and Continuing Studies in Science and Environment at Simon Fraser University, and Director Patricia Gallagher and her staff who've helped to make this evening possible. But particularly on your behalf, I really want to thank the panel, and not only for their presentation today, but for all the work that they did to get to this point and share it with us. And finally, I really want to say how impressed I am by the participation. First of all, we have huge talent in this room, that's obvious, from the people who spoke, and I know from some of the people I know who didn't speak. There's a lot of knowledge and a lot of people who have tremendous experience. But also, I was really impressed by the extent to which the inquiries that took place were about how can we do something, how can we work together. And certainly this is a start, and we've had some suggestions about how we can, as individuals and collectively, mobilize and carry the message across the country. So with those positive thoughts in mind, I hope we all go home and reflect on that and do something about it. And for now, I hope you'll join with me and express our appreciation to a terrific panel and a wonderful report. Thank you very much.